We now turn to look at Locke's view of property and tyranny. Now, what Locke attempts to do is justify property, and the way he does it is in the following manner. He begins with the assumption the earth is given to all of us by God for our support and comfort of our being, and so all the fruits and beasts and land and so forth belongs to everyone. And so initially, no one has exclusive dominion in any of them in the natural state. But, and here's where property starts getting into play, so to speak. Now, if we're in a situation, imagine sort of the scenario, people hanging out, there's trees and animals and so forth, it all belongs to us in common, because God creates it, gives it to all of us. But before we can use any of it, for example, before the apple is useful, or the venison from the deer is useful, then it must be claimed by an individual. So the person has to go and get the apple and eat it, or kill the deer and cook it. So what then is the basis of this ownership? Well, again, the assumption is that initially everything belongs in common to everyone. And here's how private property, according to Locke, gets going. So initially, the earth and everything is common to all of us. And each individual has in themselves their own property. Although, as we saw earlier, one reason why it's wrong for people to kill each other, as Locke sees it, is that we're God's property. He owns us. So if we're hurting other people, we're busting up God's stuff. That's wrong. But God's kind of cool about owning us. So from the standpoint of property, each person owns themselves. Keeping in mind, of course, that behind all that, God owns all of us because he created us. And so as Locke sees it, since each person owns him or herself, so for example, I own myself, so my labor, my work is mine. And so if I remove something from the state of nature and mix my labor with it, I sort of mix in my ownership and make it mine. To use kind of an analogy or a bit of a story. Suppose, we're all on a ship, and the ship gets, wrecked and we wash up on a desert island. And, someone is very, very active and they go and gather up, Gilligan's Island style coconuts and thatch and so forth. And they build a hut and all kinds of fancy stuff and, put all these coconuts and food into place. And someone else, they come back from one of their gathering, they find someone laying there in their coconut hammock. And in that case, of course, the person who just kind of moved in has no right to it. And the person who did all the work, who gathered all the coconuts, gathered all the fronds, built the hut and so forth, it's theirs, because all of that stuff is on the island available to everyone. But once a person takes it and puts the work into it, at least according to Locke, it belongs to them. So his theory is basically a mixing of labor type of deal. The idea is that you own yourself, you own your own labor, so whatever you mix your labor with becomes yours. Now Locke's kind of vague exactly how this mixing stuff works, but he does put a proviso, a limit on how much you can take. And he says that each person only has a right to take in the following limits. They must leave enough and as good in common for others. And I generally sort of look at this as sort of like the party rule, in the sense that, if you go to a party and there's, food, chips and dip and snacks and so forth, there's a general rule. The correct thing to do is, since the food is there for everyone at the party, you have a right to take any of it. But of course, you don't have a right to take all of it. So if I go and, grab all the chips and everything and just take it away, I shouldn't be doing that. Similarly, to take all the best stuff, to go to suppose there's some really good expensive food there, like some lobster or something, to go and just grab all that would be wrong. So Locke's view is basically, I can take as much as I need, provided, first, I leave enough for everyone else, and secondly, I leave as good for everyone else. So I can't take everything, and I can't take all the very best. And the question would arise then, what justifies this view, that I just can't grab everything? Well, he appeals to essentially his religious view, namely that God has given us all these things to enjoy, but not to just keep until they spoil. So kind of his guiding principle for this is, we're allowed to take as much as we can use before it spoils, before it goes bad. And if we take what is beyond this, that's beyond our share. So, for example, suppose I can eat 3 apples and 2 pounds of venison a day. If I take more than that and just take it back to like my hut or my cave or whatever, and it spoils, then I'm taking too much according to Locke, because I'm only entitled to what I can actually use. Because he believes that God, when he creates the world, he didn't create it for us to spoil or destroy, it was created for us to use. And he notes or claims that, back in the beginning, there were so few people that this wasn't really a problem, or so he claims. Obviously now, much more of a problem. Now, a final point he considers here is a point of considerable interest, namely this. Given his sort of initial view that you can only take what you need, and you can't let stuff spoil, and you have to leave as much as is good for others, the rather obvious question that arises as we look around the world today with people who are, billionaires and other people who have nothing, who live in the streets and just barely survive from day to day, perhaps scavenging from dumpsters and trash heaps and so forth for food. How do we justify that? Well, Locke, in a way kind of inconsistently with his own view, explains this in terms of gold and silver. And he notes that gold and silver, and today we could, modify this to, other forms of currency, is he sees that they only have value because we consent to have them have value. And he claims, alleges, that we've agreed to a disproportionate, unequal possession of the earth. Why? Well, he claims that by tacit, and tacit consent is basically we agree to something without consciously, explicitly doing so. For example, if you have a Florida's driver's license, one thing you'll notice if you go and look at it carefully, by having a license, you agree to a breathalyzer test. They might not have told you this, and you probably don't recall explicitly like signing a form agreeing to it, but tacitly, by mere possession of that driver's license, you agree to the test. And it also notes, in addition to the tacit consent, also voluntary consent. People simply agree to this. And he claims, and this allows people, this method, allows people to fairly possess more land than whose product, the person can use. How so? Well, basically, to put it in sort of like a story, we're kind of like this. As Locke sees it, a person can receive gold and silver for the surplus. And of course, if you look at, suppose you've got, you happen to have like some gold or silver item, a ring, a necklace or something, look at it and see if you can find the expiration date, when it goes bad. And of course, obviously enough, you don't find that because gold and silver do not go bad. In fact, some years back, I saw the History Channel special on life after us. What would happen if we just vanished or died off? And one kind of interesting thing was our gold stored in our vaults would just exist on essentially until the Earth was destroyed. It would just keep on going. And so I could stockpile, going back to my little story thing. Suppose we're back on the island, and what I do is I find like some gold or silver, and I start buying surplus land from people. I say, oh, I'll give you some of the silver and gold for that land, and then eventually I own all of the land. So in that case, Locke would say, well, that's that's fair. Even though I've got all of this land, I can hoard up the silver and gold because it won't go bad. It'll never spoil. So I can thus own everything fairly, or so he claims. Now, of course, in the face of it, it seems inconsistent with his previous view. After all, he said, I can only take, what I can use, and it would seem that if I'm, gathering up all this land and selling it off, I'm taking a surplus. I'm taking more than I can use. Even though I'm selling it off, of course, for gold and silver, it seems like I'm taking far more than I'm entitled to. So there seems to be that tension in Locke's view. So again, to recap his view of property, basically you own yourself, and so you own your labor. Whatever you mix your labor with becomes yours. How much can you take? Well, Locke initially says you can only take what you can use. If it's extra and it would spoil, not entitled to that. Also, you got to leave enough for everyone else, and you can't take all the best stuff. So basically you leave it as good and as much for everyone else. But then he throws in the thing about gold and silver, which allows people to basically create a surplus, by hoarding up gold and silver, and by doing that by acquiring more land. But again, that seems to be in direct contrast with his proviso about taking only what one can use. We now turn to the final part of Locke, namely his view of tyranny. Now, this is of relevance today because obviously there's still tyrants, and even in the United States, we often hear people talking about, accusing Obama of being a tyrant. And so it'd be important to know what actually tyranny is, what it is to be a tyrant. Now, this is, of course, in the context of Locke's theory, and just because Locke said it doesn't mean it's automatically right, but it does provide a considered definition of tyranny. As he sees it, tyranny is the following. It is essentially, the following two main qualities. First, it is an exercise of power beyond right. Secondly, basically defining sort of its, scope, it's using power not for the good of those under it, but for a person's own private, separate advantage. So the gist of it is that tyranny is when the person in power and authority uses that power or authority not for the good of the people, but for their own advantage, for their own private gain. And as you might imagine, by this definition, most politicians today would be tyrants. So how does tyranny occur? Well, Locke says in the following sorts of conditions. When the person who's the authority makes their own will and not the law of the rule. And so if they're acting not based on the law, but simply on their own will, doing things beyond the law, they would be engaged in tyranny. And we see, for example, in the Bush administration and now in the Obama administration, some people have accused the way the war on terror is conducted as involving tyranny, where the president simply, wills or presents these executive orders or makes things happen, like drone assassinations, waterboarding, etc., that some would claim go beyond the law. Secondly, the person who has the authority doesn't direct their commands and actions to the preservations of the properties of the people, but rather directs them to satisfy their own ambition, revenge, greed, or other such passions. So basically when the person is, as Locke sees it, is acting not for the good of the people, but acting from their own motivations. He also, to throw in yet more to the definition, tyranny also involves transgressing the law in order to harm another. And to exceed this, the authority given by the law, Locke sees that as tyranny. Now he also notes that such tyrants can be opposed. Why? Well, when a person acts with tyranny, they're acting beyond their authority, and hence they've lost the right to expect to be obeyed. Now he notes, kind of an interesting point, if you've seen the shows fictional or real about the law, one thing you might have noted is that in the United States, that if someone wants to, if the police want to arrest somebody, they can give an arrest warrant, but if the person is in their house, they need a warrant to get to that person's house. And this comes from English common law. As Locke notes, even if a person in authority has the right to seize someone in the street, if he tries to break into someone's house without the appropriate authority, then he may be opposed. And of course we practice this in the United States, namely that in general, when things are being done in accordance with law, people need a warrant. The police need a warrant to get into someone's house. They just can't just bust in anytime they want, at least in theory. Now he believes this holds to all levels of authority, ranging from the lowest to the highest. In fact, he notes that someone who has much greater trust put in them gets a much greater betrayal if they engage in tyranny. So to recap Locke's view of tyranny, the basic idea is that tyranny is when the authority exceeds their legitimate power in order to harm another. And this is typically done, as Locke notes, when the person is acting not to satisfy the good of the people, but to satisfy their own motivation, such as greed, ambition, revenge, etc. And that brings us to the end of looking at A Civil Government by our good dead friend, John Locke.